This second part of the lecture will focus on the lesson planning. I would like to start by explaining how schools encompass the national curriculum strands. So all 5 of these national curriculum strands are moved over into school core themes. The school core themes include health and well-being, relationships, and living in the wider world. You can see that there are 3 themes, which is very good as our school year is split up into 3 different terms. So 3 terms can have, one term will focus on health and well-being, 1 term will focus on relationships, and perhaps the summer term will focus on living in the wider world. So these core themes, as you can see across the top, are then moved into different objectives once again, which meet the previous strands. So health and well-being, also referred to here as looking after me, encompasses a healthy lifestyle, nutrition and foods, changing and growing, emotions, identifying strengths and weaknesses, physical, emotional and mental health, safety and first aid. Now you can see after a few of these here, I've put either Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2. That is because we here think that certain topics need to be covered in certain year groups. However, we certainly make sure that the learning gets harder and harder and more challenging as they grow older. So they're learning a similar topic, but the objectives are slightly more difficult. If we move on to relationships, you can see we've got communication, collaboration, bullying, similarities and differences, fairness, family and friends. Now, certain topics tend to have a very big emphasis placed upon them. They tend to be very, very important, such as bullying. So you can see here at bullying, we've got both Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. Finally, living in the wider world, we've got rules and responsibilities, discrimination, finance and careers. So schools take these core themes and put them into a long-term plan. You can see across the top we've got the different terms. We've got autumn, spring and summer, and then the different topics. We've got looking after me, relationships and living in the wider world. You can then see those different topics here and certain suggestions underneath. This is a Key Stage 1 plan, and this is everything that Key Stage 1 will cover for the year 1 and 2. I just want to go over how we teach PSHE and when we teach it. So even though it is a non-statutory subject, in the United Kingdom, it tends to be that PSHE will be taught for 1/2 an hour session per week. Here at NLCS JG, we teach it slightly differently. We decide, in order for the children to really grasp onto our topics, that we want to teach them and focus on it for 1/2 day per half term. So, for lower Key Stage 1, for lower Key Stage 2, every single half day, they will focus on a topic for 3 hours. For upper Key Stage 2, where their targets and our objectives are slightly more difficult and we feel like they need a longer time to focus on it, they have their 1/2 day every half term, and they also have 2 half sessions per week, 1/2 an hour sessions per week, which is with their tutor. The reasons why we choose to do this here are because we want to make sure that the lessons are definitely taking place. Because PSHE can sometimes be seen as a subject which is not as important because it is not a core subject, sometimes teachers can take it off their weekly timetable in order to focus on different things. We are very, very passionate about PSHE here, so we want to make sure that it is taught. So we have this entire half a day, which is seen as an event for the children. We allow pupils the opportunity to delve deeper into those subject areas, to make sure that they have the time to ask those questions. To make sure that all objectives are covered in a timely manner so that they're not rushed, We also want to allow teachers to adapt the planning. So that means that in this half day, some of the children might ask very important questions, but that might not necessarily be in their planning. So teachers need the time to go off topic, to be able to have the confidence and to be able to answer those questions with enough time instead of it being rushed. Now, PSHE is taught in Key Stage 1 and Lower Key Stage 2 by the classroom teacher. However, here at NLCS Jeju, we have a tutor specialised programme where the children are taught by specialist teachers. So that means that their tutors, their class teacher, is a tutor, somebody that they will see around school, and they see them twice a week individually as part of a small group, and they will also see them every day, potentially in a subject that they might teach. These tutors are seen as their one-to-one connection that they can approach about anything. And that's really important that they have that connection, which is why we focus that long period of time on that. So I'm now going to move on to my lesson, and I'm going to show you how I would plan a lesson. So my focus is going to be on Lower Key Stage 2, and we're going to be looking at the theme, Looking After Me. We're also going to be making sure that we're meeting the objectives from identifying strengths and weaknesses. Now, here at NLCS, we have a 3-hour day plan. However, I've pulled it down into a slightly less time zone and made sure that's only half an hour to 45 minutes. As you can see, a PSHE lesson plan should look exactly the same as any other subjects. You can see that for today's lesson that I'm going to tell you about, I decided to look at identifying strengths and weaknesses. This comes under the theme of looking after me. And you can see that I still have put in there core expectations, which means the learning outcomes and the objectives, and I've also put in a stretch and challenge section. It's very, very important to understand that children, certain children, need to be stretched and challenged in PSHE. As you can see, these outcomes have come directly from the Department for Educational National Curriculum strands. As you can see, I have made explicit links, such as recognising their self-worth as individuals by identifying positive things about themselves and their achievements. The children should be able to see their mistakes, making amends and setting personal goals in order to face new challenges positively by collecting information, looking for help, making responsible choices, and finally, taking action. So the way in which I have tried to make sure that I have met these targets are through my outcomes, and I would like to read them to you now. My first objective is for all children, and these objectives should be met by every single child in the classroom, to identify a strength of their own and to think of an example of when they have shown that strength to recognise their worth as an individual. So it's all about self-worth, and every single child in a Year 4 class especially should be able to think about what they are good at, should be able to think about one strength. Now, if a child cannot think about a strength, then it certainly needs to be the classroom teacher's job to pull that strength out of them and to help them. And I'll go into how the classroom teacher should do that later. My second objective is that every single child should be able to think of a weakness and to be able to think of an example of when they have shown that weakness. This one is slightly more complicated because we do not want to say to children, "What are you not very good at?" That's certainly not having a positive mindset. We want to say to them, "What do you want to get better at?" And hopefully the teacher should be able to scaffold their lesson. They should be able to help the children to be able to identify an area that they want to get better at. And finally, the children, every single child, should be able to understand that everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. They should be able to see that everybody is different and that everybody is better at things, and some people might need to be better at other things to them. So for my stretch and challenge section, and underneath this bit it says the most able students. So the students that are able to push themselves a little bit higher, are able to really think and to stretch for the ceiling, should be able to identify their strengths with examples and to think of a way to continue helping others with their strengths in order to recognise their worth as an individual. Now this hopefully will be covered by a child recognising that a strength potentially might not be, oh, I'm good at football. It could be something such as, I am kind. And they would be able to recognise that they can continue to help other people by being kind, and think of examples to link in with that. Secondly, those more able students should not only be able to identify their weaknesses with examples, they should also be able to set themselves a goal in order to change this weakness into a strength. And that personal goal, hopefully, will be something that they will be able to cover during the lesson. And finally, we want those children to identify that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, to be able to tell other people what their strengths are, as well as helping other children to overcome their weakness by helping them set other goals. So this is stretching those higher children to help others. Now, differentiation should definitely happen in PSHE. And differentiation links in with that previous slide because differentiation is a way to help those children who we need to push slightly higher, but also help those children that might struggle emotionally. So what is differentiation? Differentiation is the process of adapting teaching so that all learners are able to achieve in lessons. This should include the use of a variety of teaching techniques and lesson adaptations to ensure that all learners are able to access the lesson and are able to achieve. In every class, there will be a diverse group of students who have different abilities, learning needs, and they should also have different achievement levels. So just like an English lesson, you have different children with different needs. Some children might need more support. Some children might need pushing higher. And that's exactly the same in PSHE. Differentiation can be achieved in PSHE through practice, so through the teacher and what they are doing, through the process, so through the activities that you are giving them, through the products, through the content, by assessment, and by grouping them. So one of the objectives were for those high ability children to help others, so grouping the children together to help them. Why do we need to differentiate in PSHE? Even though PSHE is not an academic subject, it is still important to recognise that children are at different stages in their knowledge of emotional and mature behaviour and skills. Certain children may excel in expressing themselves academically, but struggle with expressing their emotional needs. To ensure that all children feel that they are achieving, especially with a subject which should be very unique and personal to them. So PSHE, as we've spoken about, is about the individual child. It's about every single child in that classroom. And the reason that we need to differentiate is so that every child achieves. So the ways that I have differentiated in this lesson I'm about to show you is through teacher questioning. And this is the most powerful tool in PSHE. PSHE should be a lesson where the teacher should lead it, but the children are showing the teacher where they want to go and what they want to learn. And the teacher can certainly make that happen through questioning them. If you know that you have a child in your class that is emotionally intelligent and is able to show their maturity, you might choose to ask them harder questions, to ask for examples. If you have a child that isn't as emotionally intelligent, that isn't as mature and will not be able to think of an example, you may ask them to express their views in a different way. Extension tasks. Often, in mathematics at school here, I will set the children lots of different extension tasks to make sure that they can show the skill that they have learned in lots of different ways. In PSHE, it is exactly the same. We should be offering the children different opportunities to show off that skill. If they have identified their own strength, move them on to identifying everybody in the class's strength. And finally, differentiating in terms of the work that they will produce, and that is setting children different tasks. having different expectations of certain children. So let me start with my hook, which is a starter, and that is how the lesson begins. So a starter should always be exciting. It should hook the children in. Make sure that their learning starts off in a really positive way to make sure that they are engaged. My starter for this lesson, which I have already done, was to ask the questions, what are you good at? Can everybody be good at everything? So I had planned a carousel of fun activities. We did fun wars, a staring competition, a memory game, rock, paper, scissors, and noughts and crosses. The aim of this carousel was to show the children that everybody has different strengths, and sometimes even silly little games can show that. Okay, so it should have given them the opportunity to make sure that they won at something, but also potentially that they didn't win at something. This would be a very, very quick starter and would move on to going back to the classroom and asking the children, what were people's strengths? So for example, a child in my class put their hand up and said, Josh was really good at thumb wars. Laura was really good at the staring competition. They might have been particularly good at a certain memory game, and it's really important that you question the children and make sure that they are focusing on the positive, okay, on the strengths. At this point in the lesson, we do not want to discuss weaknesses. We are on a positive point. We've just warmed up the children. We want to talk about strengths, okay? We then move on to thinking about the different children in the classroom, okay, and what their strengths might be. Not necessarily about these games, but in general. So I might ask them, not these games, but what is the strength of yours? And to begin with, a lot of children might not understand what a strength is. So I scaffold by giving them some examples of what a strength is. Friendly, honest, funny, independent, inspiring. I also collected lots of photos of our teachers around at school, and I gave them strengths. So for example, one of our teachers here, I said was very kind and helpful. So giving children really explicit examples. We then moved on to our first activity. I asked them, could everybody in our classroom with 22 children have the same strength? I then asked them to fill out a sheet and say what each other person is good at. What is their strength? At the end of the activity, every single child in the classroom had 22 strengths that they could look at, and those were things that other people thought that they were good at. So you can see here, this child's strengths, their classmates said that they were caring, confident, a good friend and creative. Some children chose to write good at football, and they potentially would need help in order to scaffold into slightly different strengths that doesn't focus on an ability and more of a personality trait. We would then move on to activity 2, and this was identifying each single child. They should all have 22 different strengths that their classmates have identified for them. This is them identifying what their favourite ones that their classmates have said about them. So this child said that their favourite 2 strengths that their classmates identified themselves as was kind and friendly and respectable. And then they identified what they thought their greatest strength was, being a good friend to everyone. So as you can see, I have scaffolded the lesson, I've moved the lesson on to make sure that the child not only could have identified a strength about themselves, they were able to collect 22 strengths about themselves, but as well choose their favourite strength. This also would have pushed the hires to show that they could identify 21 strengths about other people. We then had an extension task for those children that managed to finish this, and that was to create a silent jigsaw. So each child in the class would get a jigsaw piece and they would write their strength on there. and then they would try and put them all together to show that even though we all have different strengths, we can all fit together. As a final activity, we have a different sort of activity that we haven't seen before. So, as a class, we have identified what we are good at and what our strengths are. We're now going to look at the opposite end of the spectrum. What is the opposite to a strength? So I'm asking the children to identify, if we've got strengths, what must we also have? A weakness. Now here I've put in my plan that is very, very important to stress to the children that a weakness is something that we haven't yet turned into a strength, okay? And it's not just a case of saying this is what a weakness is. We talk about how we feel about a weakness. We talk about how other people will have different weaknesses. And this will come into play with the other objectives to showing the children that we need to be empathetic to other children and their weaknesses, because they might not be very confident to share what they are not very good at. We then don't ask the children to identify their weaknesses yet. What I ask them to do is to look at some case studies that I have up on the board. And this is an example of a case study that I had up on my board. My name is Una. Today I was told off by my teacher for not speaking English at school. I feel very sad because I cannot speak English very well. This was an important example, and it was a case that I felt that most of my children could relate to, that some of my lower academically achieving children might feel. So it was very, very important to try and pull out of them, what could we say to Una? What advice could we give her? It was important that whilst we looked at that, I said to the children that weaknesses are just a skill that we haven't turned into a strength yet. You possess that skill, but it needs to be strengthened and polished before becoming a talent. Okay? Once we'd done a case study, such as Una, I then asked the children to think of their own weakness, and they wrote in their books what their weakness was and set themselves personal goals. Now, an extension for those higher ability children, after they'd finished this one, was to then respond to Una. And this is a response from one of the girls in my class to Una. Dear Una, I am sorry that you are sad and upset. This has happened to me before too. Sometimes it is hard to speak in a language that you do not understand fully, but I think that you will be better at English now than what you used to be. You should keep trying your best every day and your English will get more better. Good luck, from Ellie. So as you can see, this child has really pushed themselves to think about how she can support Una. She's used herself as an example and she's been very empathetic. Now, after the lesson, so that would be the end of my lesson, and that would probably take about half an hour to 40 minutes to finish that lesson. And it would be very, very important during the lesson to make sure that I scaffolded my children's learning by asking lots of questions. Now, finally, you can see I'm going to move on to assessment. In the lesson, I would assess the children by their answers to my questions that I have asked them. Now, I would ask open questions that would require a response that is bigger than yes or no. I would also assess the children by seeing how quickly they take to a task. If I can see a child is struggling, they don't understand the task, they need some support, in my head I would be saying they're struggling with this, they need some support. I would also, in the lesson, assess them by understanding each and every single child and them as an individual. I would see their work rate, I would see what they were producing, I would understand my own children. And PSHE is one of those topics where you really get to know every single child in your class, and it really requires that from you. After the lesson, I would assess the children from the work that they had produced. I would assess them by seeing if the lesson had long-lasting effects. If I had a child in my class from this lesson, I would hope that they would be more confident, that they would be able to see their strengths, and I would be able to assess them by seeing if after a week or so they were just slightly more confident when talking about their self-worth. And also recognising if it might potentially change children's behaviour. If there was a child who wasn't very empathetic in my class, who went around and talking to other children highlighted their weaknesses, I would look out to see if they had changed their behaviour based on this lesson. And you can see here that I would mainly reflect back on the lesson to decide if what I had planned had allowed all children to meet the core expectations of all students should be able to. And I should also see that all children have achieved something in some way. Now, my core expectations, my outcomes, my objectives, which I had for the lesson, were to identify a strength. Every single child in my class was able to identify one of their own strengths. If that was a case of they identified it after their classmates had helped them, that was still fine. They still had a strength and they could think of an example. To identify a weakness. Now, with scaffolding, with questioning, with support, all children were able to do this. And finally, everybody was able to understand their own strengths and weaknesses and how everybody had different ones by labelling what other people's strengths were. And I definitely had a couple of children that I was able to stretch and challenge. Now, finally, I have a few key questions for you to answer. Number 1, what are the 3 core themes that schools turn the national curriculum strands into? Number 2, why is it important that schools include timetabled PSHE sessions? Number 3, is it okay to go off task in PSHE sessions to discuss certain topics which children might be more interested in? Number 4, can you name a way to differentiate in PSHE? Number 5, how can you assess your pupils based on the objectives that you have set them? And finally, I have set you a task based upon a scenario below, and I would like you to plan a very, very short lesson, 20 minutes, on how you would tackle this problem in your class. 2 large groups of children in your classroom have had an argument over the use of the football court. The children have been arguing for over 2 weeks in the playground, and it has been brought up in a lesson today. Thank you very much for listening to my lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.